24, and after 6 years in medical school in Edinburgh, Keng returns home. The first Chinese to be awarded the Queen's Scholarship, graduating with first-class honors. In Edinburgh, he'd been exposed to the brilliant minds in medical research and was impressed by the social advancement that he saw. He was inspired to bring about a better tomorrow for those back home. It was then a country of immigrants under the British Crown, and there was much to do. He devoted his whole life towards finding that right balance between what was progressive in the West and the values inherent in his own Chinese culture. Keng set up his clinic in the neighborhood where he lived, at Teloae. His father died of poisoning because of inappropriate medical care. That moved him to study medicine. He became the first Chinese to practice Western medicine in Singapore. Within 2 years, his medical skills were widely acclaimed, and he had opened the way for Western medicine to gain ground with the Chinese. He cured the Chinese consul general of prolonged tuberculosis, and that shot him into prominence. Keng was a straight-born Chinese. His grandfather, an immigrant from China, married a girl from Penang before settling down in Singapore. He worked in the liquor store owned by a Chiang Hong Lim.
Ya, mari main lah. Cuma kau tunggu.
Boon Keng's father died when he was only 16, and his grandfather took over the care of the family. Boon Keng spent his early years in a private Chinese school before transferring to Raffles Institution at the age of 10. When his father died, Boon Keng almost had to leave school because of financial difficulties.
And so he stopped schooling, and his principal missed him. His master came to look up the great-grandfather, asked him why this boy not studying. The grandfather must have told him that he wanted him to learn doing business. So Mr. Hallett, his principal, got nowhere. So eventually he went to see Mr. Zhang Fanglin and asked him to intervene.
That was how Mr. Hallett got Boon Keng back to school. Then the headmaster, he saw in Boon Keng a brilliant student and took a personal interest in preparing him for the Queen's Scholarship. Britain at the turn of the century was at the height of its empire. Boon Keng's exposure in Edinburgh left an indelible mark on him. It was to shape his thinking and ideas for change in the society he was to return to. Singapore, then largely an island of immigrants indulging in trading activities, which supported that very empire Boon Keng admired. As a Straits Chinese himself, Boon Keng was in an educated class, a minority removed from those who lived and worked in the docks and in the streets. He could see the disparity between the Chinese immigrants and the Straits Chinese and wanted to bridge the gap. Lim embarked on a campaign to reach out to the larger Chinese population, making them think about the issues that directly affected their lives and the urgent need for change. In 1894, outside the town hall, Boon Keng spoke up strongly against the evils of opium smoking. He urged the government to set up an anti-opium center for immediate action against the abuse of opium. Although the unit was not formed till 12 years later, he had brought attention to the problem. An enlightened man, he also addressed other issues relating to government policies and education. For instance, he criticized excessive military taxes and the miserable state of Chinese schools. Highly respected as a man of action with the courage and conviction to speak his mind, he pushed for reform and soon became the spokesman for the Chinese. In August 1895, Lim Boon Keng was nominated for the post of Legislative Councillor by two former members, Tan Jiak Kim and Xia Liang Xia. The governor, Sir Charles, felt that at 26, Lim Boon Keng was too young to command the respect of the community. Nor had he the stature and standing of his wealthy predecessors. He was also seen as a young man with controversial views. But the public was behind Lim, and the governor gave in to a popular choice. Lim Boon Keng thus became the youngest legislative councillor ever. He was the first to serve on the council with such high academic achievements, and not because of wealth alone. As the only Chinese legislative councillor, Lim Boon Keng urged the government to set up Chinese schools, but in vain. There were then only a few private schools run by the Chinese themselves, catering to the various dialect groups. The Chinese Babas went to English schools, knowing little of their Chinese culture or speaking the language. In the eyes of the Chinese masses, they were people without roots. Lim Boon Keng set out to stop the trend. In 1896, Lim, together with Song Ong Siang, another Queen scholar and a Straits-born, set up a society to help the Straits Chinese learn their mother tongue. The society also encouraged the Straits Chinese to appreciate the works of sages like Confucius and Mencius, and to develop a keen interest in Chinese affairs. At his own home and in several Straits Chinese societies, Lim conducted Chinese lessons and talked about Confucian ethics to his fellow Babas. He believed that every Chinese child should master his own language first, before English. To help the Babas learn Chinese, he translated a few articles from the famous Chinese classics into a local dialect. With the help of Song, Lim launched the Straits Chinese magazine in 1897. The magazine published English articles on Chinese history and culture for the benefit of the English-educated Straits Chinese. Lim used the magazine to spread his ideas of reform. He contributed quite a number of articles in which he gave his views on the social situation and the way of life which he felt hindered progress. While Lim promoted Chinese philosophy and culture, he was also equally against customs which were backward. Among them, the wearing of the queue and the binding of women's feet. He suggested the cutting of the queue as the first step to reform. To the conservatives, it meant cutting off their Chinese ties, and an expression of revolt in China. Even his longtime supporters like Tan Jiak Kim and Xia Liang Xia were appalled at his suggestion. Lim created an uproar and almost lost his seat in the Legislative Council. But undeterred, he won some group support. That was in 1898. 13 years before the fall of the Qing dynasty. With that, the queue became a thing of the past. In the same year, Lim Boon Keng, together with a well-known Chinese scholar, Ku Seok Wan, co-founded a newspaper, Tianyan Xinpao. Lim wrote articles advocating Confucianism and supported the reform movement in China. Lim was to find himself embroiled with the events taking place in China. He found the idea of gradual reform in China appealing and supported people like Kang Yuwei, especially when Kang came here after the reform movement was crushed. But Lim had to work with the existing order in order to keep track of China's development, serving as medical advisor and publishing a book on basic hygiene. Initially, Lim opposed Sun Yat-sen's idea of violent revolution in China. However, with the successful overthrow of the Qing dynasty in 1911, Lim was prepared to serve Sun Yat-sen as his confidential secretary and medical officer. But Lim wanted to show that his loyalties were still with the British Crown. He formed a Chinese company in the volunteer corps. Education was always a top priority with Lim Boon Keng, and he was to pay particular attention to the education of women. He felt that progress was only possible if the women folk also went to school. At first, he met with some resistance, but with like-minded leaders like Song Ong Siang, he managed to raise $6,000 to start the Singapore Chinese Girls' School in 1899. The first lessons began in June that year with 7 students, increasing to 30 within 2 months. The school continued to face financial difficulties, but Lim Boon Keng was determined to break the mindset that a woman's place was in the home.
He must have realized education is a crucial point in changing his life. If he had stopped at 16, going to do business, he would have missed a lot of things in life. Because his sisters did not have proper education, so he thought of giving education to his sisters first and the other girls. So he started to organize a class for girls.
The school at Emerald Hill was Lim's house until 1920. Girls going to school today is something taken for granted, but what Lim and Song started up was to pave the way for more local women to be actively involved in the social evolution to come. Whilst pushing for social reforms, Lim Boon Keng was also to be a pioneer in 2 important commercial fields. He was always at the forefront of anything that hinted at progress and success. He was introduced to rubber by Henry Ridley, the head of the Botanic Gardens, who spoke of their economic worth. Lim Boon Keng saw the prospects for the industry, and after much research with Tan Che Yan, he set up a rubber plantation in Chua Chu Kang, the first to be owned by a Chinese. He also encouraged his good friend, Tan Kah Kee, to do the same, thus marking an important step in the development of the rubber industry. Because of his commercial involvements, he was to develop insurance and financial institutions and became chairman of several banks. In 1920, a meeting with Tan Kah Kee was to change the course of Lim Boon Keng's life. Tan, a patron of education, had already set up a string of schools in Amoy in Fujian province, and he had plans for expansion. He sought Lim's advice, and Lim encouraged him to start a university. Lim had long hoped that a Chinese university could be set up in southern China to provide tertiary education for the locals as well as overseas Chinese. It would ensure a supply of Chinese secondary teachers for Southeast Asia. When Amoy University opened in 1921, Tan invited Lim to be the principal. Without any hesitation, Lim agreed. He sold part of his property and set up a foundation under his name, the proceeds of which went to Amoy University, Raffles Institution, and his family.
他是为了交易，他不顾自己本身的利益。他的离开新加坡到中国去这个主持厦门大学时，对这个他自己这个来讲，价值上很高，但在物质上的损失非常的大。他这边所有的事业我们都放弃了。
As a consequence of his absence from Singapore, he lost his fortune. He lost everything he had in Singapore, but he never mentioned this sort of thing to us. And I think except very few close friends, very few people will hear of it, hear that how and why he lost all his money almost overnight.
Lim Boon Keng moved with his family to Amoy and stayed there for the next 16 years. For the first few years, he worked for free, and when the university faced financial difficulty, Lim traveled the region to raise funds. He was already in his late 50s.
同时在这个厦门，大家知道他是很高级的医秀的专家了，所以他替人家看病，看的钱都交给厦门大学，不是自己收的，啊，好像一个人生病，就叫他看，你要还多少可以，这个钱都是给厦大。
Lim's old house at Beach Yacht Hill is still standing, but is now in a dilapidated state. After his death, the house was donated to the University of Amoy. This 72-year-old institution is well known in southern China. The institution stands as a tribute to the efforts of Tan Kah Kee and Lim Boon Keng. In 1937, the Japanese invaded China. Because of the chaos and unrest and being cut off from financial aid, it was difficult to carry on. So Lim Boon Keng handed Amoy University over to the Chinese authorities and returned to Singapore at the age of 68. In 1941, Singapore entered into a state of emergency. The Pacific War had begun. Lim Boon Keng was to once again assume leadership and urge the community to give financial and moral support to the British Army. In 1942, the Japanese invasion was the beginning of a nightmare for Lim Boon Keng. The Japanese wanted to restore stability in occupied Singapore, to allow for their expansion plans and their conquest of East Asia. In order to present a facade of peace and to raise funds for Japanese forces, the Japanese set up an organization to gain popular support. While others fled, Lim Boon Keng stayed behind. The Japanese saw him as a leader to mobilize the Chinese. He was already 73 years old. Under Japanese coercion, Lim collected $50 million under the banner of the Overseas Chinese Association.
叫我大官去追迄个外侨协会会长，伊是真正唔卖啊，无变啊，逼甲伊就是敢若做小小安尼啦。逐摆伊唔是真实事，伊挑伫安尼，伊日本也逼伊做啥物，伊就抵消安尼。伊唔爱做嘛。
When the war ended, there was no question of Lim Boon Keng's loyalty. He remained a respected leader. Mr. Lee, an ex-officer of Force 136, recalls Lim's role in the war.
We knew he personally prevented several unnecessary massacres, and also made arrangements for local traders to import foodstuff to feed the people in Singapore. The Japanese trusted him. So when the Japanese were concentrating their efforts to invade Burma, Singapore enjoyed a comparatively peace and tranquility at that time. It was due mainly to Dr. Lim. For that, we must take off our hats to him.
After the war, Lim Boon Keng disappeared from the public eye, seen occasionally at private functions like this. He was getting on in years. But the public continued to acknowledge what he did. The papers named him the Sage of Singapore. And friends knew him as the Grand Old Man. Lim Boon Keng passed away on New Year's Day, 1957, at the age of 88. He was a man caught between what he saw as progressive in his Western education and the need to retain what was valuable in being Chinese. For him to be estranged from that heritage was to be like a tree severed from its roots, only to wither away and degenerate. All his life, he tried to find that balance.